On this episode is still loading. Famicom, what? Oh fuck! I know what I want.
You know what? I'm done. I thought you were a professional.
I'm leaving it in. I actually on my Streets of Rage episode, I did the same thing, and I left it all in. So fuck it, we'll fix it, not in post.
Fix it.
All right. On this episode is still loading. Famicom, what Sega won't, or some shit like that. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and welcome to the 40th anniversary showdown spectacular of the I don't know, I'm losing all these different things, but it's the 40th anniversary of Nintendo's iconic system, the Famicom, or as we know it here in North America, the Nintendo Entertainment System. And I have a jam-packed panel of people gathered here to discuss arguably the most iconic system. I don't think it's really up for debate in my personal opinion, but the most iconic system of all time, at least to us North Americans. So let's go.
Vectrex.
Well, you heard him. Let's start off with the man who just shouted out in second place, the Vectrex. My good friend of the show and friend outside of the show, Dave, aka Game Dave. Dave, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. Thanks for having me on to talk about all things Famicom.
I am so happy that you agreed to come on. And fun fact, even though our new recording setup where there's no cameras, so we can't read body language, but I am wearing a Fammy Corner T-shirt right now.
Quality. That's good.
That's my favorite shirt that I own.
See, it was the perfect shirt, and it's exclusive. You can't even get them anymore.
I mean, you all just stepped over Stefan's fantastic joke of being nude, but we'll go with that.
Oh, shirtless.
Actually, I'm wearing a My Life in Gaming T-shirt. Which
Okay.
There we go.
Actually, you can't prove that.
Well, let's move on right up to the second voice, or the voice that claims they are nude, but we're gonna just assume that they're wearing a My Life in Gaming T-shirt. Stefan, aka Art of Nintendo Power, or just the Art of Nintendo Power. Stefan, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great
today.
I'm actually Donald ducking it, so I do have the shirt on, but then just nothing underneath,
and just wearing bloomers.
That's right.
Dang, butt out, cheeking it. They call it cheeking it.
And finally, rounding out our panel to discuss the Famicom / the NES is Try from My Life in Gaming. Try, how are you doing today?
Doing good. Always up for talking about NES.
And now to keep it going, what are you wearing?
Yeah, what are you wearing? We're got to keep this going.
I am wearing a really boring green T-shirt and some of my less good shorts.
Less good. Try with the less good
shorts.
First.
B-tier shorts.
Try got
he was wearing A-tier shorts, but then found out we didn't have cameras. So it's like, you know what? I'm gonna save these puppies.
At first I was gonna be like, man, try way to ruin the bit at the very end, but then you go less good shorts and just perfect button. It was the perfect button.
That's good.
But so we are all gathered here today to reminisce, to honor, to celebrate 40 years of the Famicom. Now, for most, sorry, what?
I said marriage.
You
started with "we're gathered here today," and I was like,
It was very marriage or possibly funeral for the Famicom.
Well, it better not be a Fama funeral. So we're gonna. We're celebrating it. It's celebrating an iconic system. It came out 40 years ago. I mean, the week this is releasing, I think it, oh my God, I feel so dumb where I didn't even write down the fucking release date. But it's coming out the same week that this episode is dropping. So July 15th, this is actually, and this episode is coming out on the next day after, the 16th. So there we go. Just in time. Yesterday was the 40th anniversary of the Famicom's release in Japan. We got it a few years later over in 1995 in North America. Or sorry, 1985. However, there is some early elements of it in 1984, which we will get into and discuss and dissect and all that good stuff. But before we go into all of that, I would, of course, love to hear from my panel of their personal experiences. Like a quick, like, how did they first play the Nintendo? How did they first play the NES/Famicom? Since we started with Dave and ended with Try, let's do a snake draft type of thing. We're going to start with Try and end with Dave. So Try, how did you first play the NES, and what are some of your earliest memories with it?
Well, I was born in 1984, so I wasn't able to remember the earliest days, of course, but it was still I was gaining consciousness and acquiring memories when the NES was still pretty hot, right? So one of my clearest very young memories was going to visit my aunt and uncle, and I remember for some reason, even though we were going to her house, my cousin was with me in the car. So I don't know, maybe she was visiting us or something, but we were going to my aunt and uncle's. And she asked, while we were on the way, she said, "Hey, do you want to play Super Mario Brothers when we get there?" And I very distinctly remember having like this vague idea of what the characters Super Mario Brothers were. Like maybe I had seen commercials on TV or seen some bit of the Super Show or something, but like I remember thinking like, okay, these are like people in like overalls and hats or something. And in my head I'm just thinking, okay, play Super Mario Brothers. Like what does that mean? Like do you like you run around outside and doing something? Is it toys? Like I don't know what this means, but like I'm a kid, I like to play, and so I'm like, yeah, sure. And then when we get there and it's like, wait, this is a thing you do on the TV? You could control this thing on the TV? Like this, I was like 4 or 5, and I had never seen anything like this before. I just could not believe it. So yeah, the NES and Super Mario Brothers was my first video game experience, and obviously that was highly influential in the formation of my gaming tastes to this day. And played a few other games. I remember like Duck Hunt, of course, and Hogan's Alley, which is a kind of a weird like one of your first NES experiences games, I think, but that one's always kind of stuck with me. But yeah, I was just like immediately like, I have to have this for Christmas, and I did.
What about you, Stefan? What was some of your earliest memories and experiences with the system?
Well, I think I'm the elder statesman here, born in 1981. So the NES wasn't my first gaming experience. That's shout out to the TRS-80. But Matterhorn Screamer on the TRS-80. But the NES, I just recently told the story on another podcast, but they haven't dropped theirs yet, so it's going to be a race to who gets this story first. So
maybe I'll scoop them.
This isn't like a shitty like, oh, I was like the richest kid on my block or anything, but I was the first kid on my block to have an NES, and so other kids, my parents were freaking out because the neighborhood kids would literally break into our home to like early in the morning to play our NES. And so like my friends, I would wake up in the morning and my friends would already be sitting there playing the NES like that was a normal thing to do. That's probably one of my strongest early NES memories because my mother was just so incensed, and like she's the kind of woman that like doesn't get angry, and you'd only know that she was angry at you when she grabbed you by the face so that she like didn't hit you while she was screaming at you. And but yeah, so, so that was an early NES memory. But that was also a very big. So I'm the youngest and only boy of 6. But at the time, it was me and my two eldest sisters living in the house together, and that was both a very big like bonding thing and points of contention for us. But some of my fondest memories with my sister April is playing basically all the Capcom side scrollers were all of our favorites, like Chippendales Rescue Rangers and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
DuckTales.
Classic.
Yeah.
That's funny. Your story reminds me of you're the only person I've ever heard tell a story. Now it's like an amplified version of something that happened to me as a kid, where my neighbors like they wouldn't come over and just break into our homes, but they would come over and be like, "Hi, my mom said I could come over."
Oh,
nice. Okay. I guess you're over here now, type of thing. But like, and then I hear yours. I'm like, wow, someone else's friends did that too, but to the extreme. Just like not even like knocking on the door, just showing up while you're asleep. It's just
legit.
wild.
Just already be playing the NES.
That's insane. Dave, you're rounding this out. What is your earliest experience with the NES, and what's some of your earliest memories?
Okay, well, I'll kind of give both NES and Famicom. If you don't mind.
By all means.
So NES, I mentioned the Vectrex at the beginning because the Vectrex was my first ever video game console, which was a hand-me-down from my aunt. And I was like, this is amazing. I love this thing because it had its own screen. It didn't interrupt the television watching that was going on because we only had one TV in the house, because I'm also an 80s baby. These kids don't know how good they've got it. But I mean, we played video games on the floor. Right? Most of us, because you had to be close to the system. But when my aunt got done with her technology, we would inherit it because we didn't have a ton of money growing up. I don't think I could fathom us buying our own video game system. I didn't even really understand what that concept was, other than we had this weird thing with like 2 cartridges that plugged into it, and we would make color happen by putting an overlay on the screen. But then we got the NES and I think the Game Boy around the same time from my aunt with a couple of games, and that just changed everything. I was like, I officially love video games. Like, I really liked the Vectrex, but that was so different, and I think it was the controller is what really did it for me. It just felt right, and just that rolling sensation on B and A. That because the Vectrex, it's almost like arcade-esque because it was still that era of the joystick and then a row of buttons versus this very ergonomic thing, though I didn't know how to spell or even what that word was at the time, but that's what I was feeling. And I fell in love with it. And those first games were, of course, the combo Super Mario Brothers Duck Hunt cart. And oddly, Final Fantasy. I don't like
that.
I didn't know you were actually that early into Final Fantasy, Dave.
Yeah, my first Final Fantasy game ever was the original Final Fantasy on that NES, and I was terrible at it, but I loved it, and that was like my first exposure to role-playing games, and that's why I think I'm always going to have an affinity for Final Fantasy, just because of that experience. And yeah, Super Mario Brothers was the game. I remember, I was fairly young, so my mom would beat it. I was like, my mom can beat Super Mario Brothers? This is insane. And now, I think back on that, and I'm like, how was my mom able to beat Super Mario Brothers? But nowadays, she still tries to keep up with gaming, and it's hilarious, the games that she will get into and the calls I'll get about trying to beat levels. It's I love it, especially Luigi's Mansion. She loves like the supernatural, and she loves ghosts and things like horror movies. She was like, "Oh, Luigi's Mansion, that's cute. I gotta get that." So she's been playing Luigi's Mansion, and she just too much. It's just too much, and I think it's that simplistic, easy to pick up and play aspect of Super Mario Brothers. You get right back into the game, and you don't have a bunch of games when you start out back then, we had maybe a handful of carts. So nowadays, someone might play an old NES game and it's like, oh man, I'll play this for 5 minutes. I'm done with this. I'll move on. We had no choice. So we became masters of these games. And I really miss that about the more modern game. It's a totally different feeling. And it's I don't know if that's ever going to be captured again. I don't know if you all feel that way, but we only had so many games. And even if it sucked, we played so much of it that it's like we tricked ourselves into not noticing the levels of suckitude that those carts may have had.
Not only that, but we didn't know any better, right? Like,
exactly.
Like sucked compared to what?
Yeah,
like,
these are the games.
But at the same time, I do think there is like an inherent quality to that simplicity and just the quick access to the action, the quick response. And Dave, I liked how you talked about that rolling motion between A and B.
Because it's like so natural.
Funny enough, like it drives me nuts when people poo-poo the NES controller. I'm like, how are you holding this thing that's digging into your palms?
You're like laying and you have four, like you have your index and middles out and you're using the D, like you're just laying.
The way I hold an NES controller,
with your butt, right?
Like the corners are like not like going into flesh, and my thumbs are actually like almost nearly not quite, but nearly vertical, like going up to the D-pad and up to the A and B. But the other thing about the rolling motion between A and B, that's one of the big reasons I don't like the Dogbone controller.
Oh yeah, why who thought we're gonna put them in this order? It would have made so much more sense to angle it with B and then A. Like what?
And the thing is, the Game Boy has that same angle, and I don't mind it on the Game Boy, but I think a big thing there is, for one, you're holding it a little different, but two, I've measured, and I know it's not much, but there's like a teensy bit more space between B and A on the Dogbone and B and A on the Game Boy, and it makes, to me, a huge difference. You don't get that natural roll between B and A anymore, and I remember when I got the Dogbone, because you look at that and you're like, oh man, it's like a Super
This
Nintendo
is the ultimate controller, and then it's not.
It's curved, like, oh man, that looks so comfortable. And like I had fooled myself into thinking I had a problem that I don't. Because it's like, oh, wait, but the NES controller is comfortable. It's just other people that say it isn't. And I didn't need to solve a problem I didn't have by buying a Dogbone controller, because I don't like it. I don't like it.
But to translate that into the Famicom, which did have the more rounded edges to the shape of the controller. I mean, who doesn't love that original red and gold Famicom controller? And of course, I have a cord
run through your fingers.
Yeah, baby, it's a gripper, man. But the Famicom, I have a huge affinity for the Famicom. Obviously, I did a series on Famicom games called Famicorner.
I hate that you say past tense there, Dave. I did a series. Stop it, Dave. Don't say such horrible things.
The commenters do. So
I just believe it's on hiatus. It will return when you actually have free time, and which is almost never.
Josh, you understand?
See, I haven't seen any of it, so it's like Schrodinger's content. Like, it is both the best YouTube series and the worst that I've ever seen.
That's right, until you can officially grade. But my first experience with the Famicom, just to kind of throw that in there as well, because of course we don't have NES without the Famicom, has to do with Final Fantasy, because that discovery of, wait, where are all the other Final Fantasy games when we finally get 7? Because, there's nothing like 1, 2, 3, 7. So I, with the early advent of the internet, our family was pretty quick to delve into the internet. And I remember when eBay finally appeared, and I got a little familiar with eBay, and my parents like, what are you doing? You need to make a money order for what? I mean, the money order era of eBay is kind of weird to think about. And my first Famicom game was Final Fantasy III. And I had to figure out how I was going to make it work on the NES. And I don't think it was a honeybee adapter, but it was one of those early, very rough cartridge adapters for Famicom to NES, and had this Final Fantasy 3 cartridge. I was like, man, this art is amazing on this cartridge.
Yeah.
And plugging that in and seeing the original Japanese owners 3 insane save files with outrageous like class completion and HP, and just having no idea what to do. And so the Famicom, that was before doing YouTube videos or anything like that. So it really is interesting to think that I started the NES with Final Fantasy, and then the Famicom, also sort of got into my claws because of Final Fantasy 3, the OG.
It's funny because I remember I was really excited to get you on this episode, Dave, because I'm like, every episode you have been on, other than the one I interviewed you on, has always been Final Fantasy. And I was like, man, I'm pigeonholing this guy into Final Fantasy.
Typecast as a
And
nerd, and
you just did it yourself. Thank you.
Surprise! This guy likes RPGs. I think I'd be okay with just RPG. If that's all I could ever play ever was RPG, I'd be fine.
Oh, and speaking of RPGs, when I inevitably do a Sweet Kidded episode, I'm letting you know. I'm planning on it. If you
don't, I'll have to murder you if you don't allow me.
There are certain people that I know if I don't invite on for a specific game, I won't wake up the next morning, and that's one of them. For my own experience, I am younger than everyone, unfortunately, with this. So my
young little baby,
yeah, just a one little baby in your marriage and all that stuff.
Controller.
So my own experience with the NES, I first played it, I would probably say it was like, I want to say 95 or 96 at a friend's house who had it. And it was really before I understood what the concept of video games were. I've told this story, I believe, on other episodes, but basically I went over to his house and they were playing Super Mario 3, and I couldn't understand what I was seeing because at the time, it looked like a cartoon that I could control, and that sense of freedom and power given to like a 6-year-old is just wild. I loved cartoons. I loved Nickelodeon. I would watch that all the time, and then all of a sudden I go over to this kid's house. I'm like, wait, this is a cartoon that I can move and I can control where the characters go and what they do. It captured my imagination. I could not get enough of it. I was one of those kids that would only want to hang out with people because they had video game systems. I didn't give a shit about seeing them. I just wanted to play their systems.
Psycho. You're a psycho.
Yeah, I was not, I mean, maybe I've learned, but who knows? But, but that was my first experience with the NES. And so I didn't really own one until I started collecting, because my parents, when I asked my parents for my first console, they got me what was contemporary, which by the time they were willing to buy me one, I was 10. And so that was the N64. And Whew. Yeah, so I'm old, and I was the right age to have grown up with a Super Nintendo, but they weren't, that wasn't a thing. They didn't know I was going to be so into video games until I pestered them enough and asked them for a Sega Genesis, and then they didn't get me a Sega, they got me a Nintendo 64. So it kind of all went from there.
I just want to know, what the heck cartoons were you watching that NES looked like cartoon level?
I think it was just more the idea of it. It felt like a cartoon to me.
Pictures, man. Yeah, that's
it's on the TV.
There was a depth to those graphics, especially when you were young. I think that's even today. I think part of the appeal is that there are a lot of gaps left for your imagination. And even though I am known as for being into like video quality and getting RGB video and sharp pixels and stuff, like I still have an appreciation for the composite and RF look of NES, because some games, especially like I think of like Zelda 2 and Xanadu, which were both
cozy. It's a cozy. Yeah. It's hard to explain unless you were there.
But like, so my cousin's favorite games on the system were Zelda 2 and Xanadu, and I think Willow as well. And those games are just kind of like burned into my brain, like looking at them and just like setting my imagination, alight with, and I think that composite video is like part of it in a way, and that's like, even though it's not what I use today, I like to use RGB video today, but I still like appreciate that there's like there's like a graininess that almost feels like it's hiding detail that you then like fill in the gaps in your head. And you know, we have less and less of that kind of stuff that really strikes the imagination now.
Well, and to your point, those games were made with that video quality in mind.
Sure.
Right. Like, so like they specifically were designing games to take advantage of the fact that they could hide things between scan lines and that kind of thing.
Yeah. But even aside from video quality, just the general simplicity of it all certainly has an appeal that I think holds up today. And in fact, I mean, heck, you know, it's probably more common for indie games to go for like more of like a 32-bit style sprite, but nonetheless, like, you know, sprite art has become a style unto itself. I don't think it's like at a time when indie games were first starting to really take off, like sprite art was like, hey, we're being retro, but now it's just like it's just a choice. It's just its own thing.
Interesting how that's why NES is always going to be there. Famicom's always going to be there because it's funny to see what the cutoff is of how far back certain, you know, we'll say it's a lot of indie developers that use that style. You don't see a lot of them going back further to, you know, say the Atari 2600. You're not seeing a lot of that. And I think there's something of it wasn't quite enough until we get to that sort of 8-bit NES level.
Yeah. And I think that really ties into the legacy that we're going to talk about towards the end of the episode, where like, why does this console have such staying power? And we will definitely kind of talk more about that as...
Fine, we'll wait, Josh.
I'm trying to be a host.
You guys are screwing up my outline.
Hey, Dave, shut the heck up, all right?
Well, the last part of my own experience with the system was I got the NES years later when I started collecting, and my first game that I personally owned for it was the original TMNT game.
I'm sorry.
No, yeah. I just legit it was one of those things where I got into more like the history elements of video games because, I mean, this might sound a little cliche, but because of AVGN. Like, I didn't necessarily take away from his stuff, you know, like, oh, this game sucks, this game's bad. I kind of understood the bit, which unfortunately a lot of people don't seem. They look at like Jaws and like, oh, that game's a piece of shit. I'm like, well, it's doing some interesting things. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it does some pretty cool stuff. But I would look at stuff like that and be like, wow, games did like these types of mechanics way ahead of their time. And a lot of that was with the NES, specifically with the peripherals and whatnot. So yeah, I got into the NES as a kid, but then I didn't actually get to own one and play it consistently until I started collecting years later. And in fact, in terms of the Famicom, when I first discovered the visual look, like just the visual difference between how the Famicom looks compared to the NES, I was blown away. I actually like the Famicom's visuals, like the design of the system itself.
Yeah, it's a shame that it was stuck with, you know, RF only.
Yeah,
and hardwired controllers.
Yeah, yeah,
very short hardwired controllers.
Just sit in the floor, baby.
It's designed for a completely different culture, man. Like that Japanese apartments or Japanese housing, excuse me, just a lot smaller spaces than what we spread out here in America, probably unnecessarily so.
Yeah, we'll get to that too, I'm sure. But man, what a shame that, you know, we had to kind of wreck the very smart design of the Famicom with the NES, but I'm sure
I mean,
you're going to tell me to shut up because we're going to save that.
I love the design of the NES.
Oh, I do too.
I love the quality of the connection. It's just
well, the cart connector, yes, that is problematic, but like it's so iconic. But I do agree that, like, you know, just the Famicom does strike a cool image as well.
Anything else you'd like us to get off track there, Josh?
Yeah.
Well, we'll quick dive into some of the history of it. We're gonna quick dive into the section I have here is the Nintendo before the Famicom, and there is things on here that are super important, and especially once we get into the gaming elements. But the only points I really wanted to bring up, because it, like, you could do an entire podcast on the history of Nintendo, obviously. So this is not comprehensive in the slightest, but the company was founded in 1889 by Fusajiro Yamauchi. Did I pronounce any of that correctly?
Probably
Yamauchi?
not.
I think it's Yamauchi.
Yamauchi. Okay, Yamauchi.
Not ouchie like you've hurt yourself.
Yamauchi, I think you're right. As a Hanafuda playing card manufacturer, they also were the first card manufacturer in Japan that could manufacture Western style playing cards, i.e., spades, diamonds, clubs, that kind of thing. They tried their hand at a lot of different things before getting into games. They were just one of those companies that would, from my understanding, they would just try whatever is the fad. Like they did a thing for a while. They converted a bunch of bowling alleys into like electromechanical target ranges and stuff like that. That's like where Wild Gunman first, before it became an NES title,
there was an original Duck Hunt too.
Yep, the original Duck Hunt, electromechanical, and they tried their hands at, as you can all see on the outline, Love Hotels is their infamous one. They had
dang girl,
so hot.
And especially with that instant rice, that you could get Nintendo instant rice at a Nintendo Love Hotel.
Whoa!
And then after you're done having a good time, you could play with Nintendo Block, i.e. Nintendo Legos. And they also made vacuum cleaners and shit like that. And of course, they probably more famously for eventually getting them into game development was toys. They manufactured a lot of toys. Stefan, I would have loved for you to, just because you added it, and I think it's definitely worth shouting out, the Ultra Hand. And anything you want to add to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The Ultra Hand was one of either the first or one of the first attempts at a toy that Nintendo made, and most notably that the creator of the Ultra Hand is Gunpei Yokoi, who then went on to create the Game Boy. So yeah, that's one of the toys where you'll see it a lot in like Nintendo likes to sneak it in places, like it's in like some of the WarioWare mini games, and yeah, they rode that thing for a while. There's like a bunch of different like versions of it for different territories, and but yeah, the Ultra Hand, it's basically just one of those like spring loaded like grabby hands. You like pull the trigger and then it like it accordions out, and then it'll grab something at the end. That's what an Ultra Hand is.
And speaking of grabby hands, back to the Love Hotels. It's interesting because
Chef's kiss.
Gunpei Yokoi also made like one of those Love Tester, sort of arcade devices back then too. I don't know if that was timeline wise where that was.
No, it doesn't matter. We're kind of, it's a loose timeline, just pre.
I'm sure it's late 60s, early 70s. It's somewhere around there. But yeah, he made one of those Love Tester devices for couples where they'd hold onto the controllers and see how compatible they were. So it's interesting how much of an array of things they were involved in. And also that Gunpei Yokoi was so much a part of Nintendo even prior to, obviously the amazing Game Boy.
Dave, do you think he was like...
Y'all are forgetting the Virtual Boy. What's up with that?
Yes, Try. We are forgetting the Virtual Boy.
Never forget the Virtual Boy.
That was intentional.
It's also fun to think about how, even though the Ultra Hand really has nothing to do with the Famicom, but now the name Ultra Hand has been recycled for the core mechanic in the newest Zelda game.
Yeah.
I that went right over my head. Yeah, that has to be a callback to that.
They love to be referential.
Definitely is.
They dabbled in a lot of different things. I specifically want to shout out the Before Mario blog. If you really want to go on a deep dive and see the crazy stuff that Nintendo produced before Mario, hence the name, it's really worth a dive into. They have a lot of amazing things there. So Before Mario, it's a really great website and blog. But they did transition into gaming eventually, as did a lot of companies back then. It became the fad, as we saw when Pong became huge. A ton of companies, Sears had their own Pong console. Like all these different companies are just like, well, this is a popular thing, let's just do this. And Nintendo was right along in there. They originally tried to import the Magnavox Odyssey over to Japan, which they did actually eventually do. There is it's like you can get like a Nintendo Odyssey. I forget exactly what it's called. I guess I did a poor job in the notes and did not write it down what the name of it was, but it did get imported eventually over to Japan, and there were a few games for it and everything. It's kind of wild. They also did work on the Color TV game series, Color TV games 6 and 15. Both were created by the eventual designer of the NES, Masayuki Uemura. And these systems were kind of like what we saw with the Magnavox Odyssey, where there wasn't really like swappable cartridges. It was just a built-in set number of games that you could play. And kind of throwing back to what you mentioned before, Dave, with the color overlays, you just slap that shit on there and, a cellophane overlay, and there you go. The most important Color TV game, though, was the Block Kazushi one. It was the first one that Nintendo developed in-house, as opposed to all the others. It was kind of like just reskins, like it was like a Pong clone, that's taking an existing design and just slapping their name on it type of thing. Well, with the Block Kazushi, they designed that in-house. It wasn't some other person's design. They did it all themselves. And it was one of the first projects a young Shigeru Miyamoto worked on, where he designed the appearance of the system as well as the icons and whatnot that would appear on there. And their first ever arcade game to get them into arcades was Ever Race, or EVR. I guess it's EVR. But is there anything, before we kind of talk about, Donkey Kong and the Nintendoverse system, is there anything you guys wanted to dive into with any stuff I mentioned or stuff that I overlooked?
Yes, I have to tell Dave something.
Okay. I'm ready.
So I'm sitting here with my Twitter open, right? Just like minding my own business. And there's that little who to follow window, right? You're in there.
It knows.
It totally knows. I was just like the algorithm's freaking me out right now.
Ooh, Josh is just selling our data, our audio data, making the show.
I'm making all this money
it worked because, girl, I'm following you.
I got somebody to follow back. Yeah, baby.
Get it set up in one of those Nintendo Love hotels with some of their instant rice, and you guys are gonna have a great evening.
I just got it. Oh, okay. Now I do want to talk about Donkey Kong for one very important reason.
Go for it.
I just acquired an original Donkey Kong arcade machine.
What?
Oh, so good.
Nice.
So good. Anyway, Josh, go ahead.
I think the original Donkey Kong still just looks beautiful. I don't know what it is about the visuals. Even the arcade cabinet itself is I just love how that thing looks.
So bright and colorful.
I want one for myself. I have no space for it, but I want one.
Did Donkey Kong ever really look like that in Japan, though? Because I believe, American style arcade cabinets, I don't know if they ever at some point existed in Japan, but like, the candy cab, like the shorter sit down thing where you just like put a marquee on it and shove an arcade board inside, like that's much more emblematic of Japanese arcades. And I don't know if like in the earlier days, like did they have like custom design cabinets? Like the Donkey Kong cabinet is absolutely like one of the most iconic cabinets over here.
Yeah, really all of those Nintendo cabinets, they have the very unique shape.
Yeah.
And it was super easy compared to some of my other arcade machines to get into the house because it was not made with MDF or anything. I mean, this is plywood. So it's it's like, it's plywood. It's not glued together sawdust, but it is so much lighter to carry in because you don't have all that glue and all the it was a dream to bring it in. And then after that, we brought it in Area 51. So that was a horrible follow-up.
So I will say, Google can't find a Japanese cabinet that looks different than a U.S. cabinet. But also, just thinking about it, Nintendo wasn't that big at the time, like of a company at all. And so, like, I would hazard to guess that making two separate cabinets would probably be something that was outside of their scope.
Yeah, not ideal.
But I just don't even know if that kind of cabinet was much of a thing in Japan.
There is something to be said about the size of Donkey Kong, aside from just the plywood, but it is a much smaller form factor compared to other machines, to the point where it took me a while to figure out where to put it because it's dwarfed by other like Midway machines that I had to find a place where it kind of didn't feel so tiny, but it's so maneuverable. Like I could see why people would get into just collecting Nintendo arcade cabinets because they're all form factored and they're easier to move. They're smaller, but just a great cabinet. Like the The
Also,
plexi, everything.
it's really visually satisfying to have them all lined up and like because they all look the same. Not that I have them all, but I do have. I know, like I have a Mortal Kombat 2 and a Killer Instinct, and they're both the identical cabinet.
Yes,
and
it's so nice to see that.
Very satisfying to look at. Yes.
Yes. That's what's good about the Area 51 is it's actually in a Midway style cabinet. It's a conversion, so it's next to my Mortal Kombat 2, and they're identical shape, and it's very visually appealing.
Yes.
So yeah, Donkey Kong. I mean, I did a whole episode on it, and that you could do once again another. Like, there's so much that you could dive into with that, but it was originally a conversion of Radar Scope. After that bombed over here in North America, and I don't think it did all that well over in Japan. I think it well. I didn't research that for this episode, but it bombed over here in North America for certain. And so they had to get Miyamoto, or they tasked Miyamoto with designing his first ever game and converted Radar Scope into Donkey Kong, and it became the smash hit, which was able to then fuel Nintendo to develop the Famicom and the NES. And that's kind of where we get into the system itself. It was designed, like I said before, by Masayuki Uemura. I found an amazing article by Retronaut Jeremy Parrish where he interviewed Uemura about, this is, I think in 2015, I want to say this was. I think it was like the 35th anniversary or the 30th anniversary of the NES release from '85 back then that he interviewed him for, and he just talks about how he worked a lot of overtime. Nintendo provided free udon noodles for employees, which how nice of them. Just a bunch of free ramen, probably very healthy to work 60 hours or probably more than that, probably like 100 hours a week.
It was probably and cigarettes, by the way. They probably just also gave them as many cigarettes as they could possibly smoke.
Cigarettes over there. Oh my gosh.
I mean, just fueled by nothing but udon and tobacco and nicotine. The project came about because basically Nintendo's kind of started seeing the writing on the walls with a lot of the dedicated systems, with how they knew that the Game & Watch series, which was still very popular when they first started designing it, they knew it wasn't going to last forever. So they wanted to design a system that could have swappable cartridges or swappable software similar to what the Atari 2600 and obviously the Fairchild Channel F prior to that. They wanted to create a system, and they weren't quite sure exactly how they were going to do or what they were going to do. And Uemura had a lot of setbacks when he first started, in the sense that a lot of his team members jumped ship over to the Game & Watch and arcade departments of Nintendo. So at one point in time, he only had 3 people. Like in the beginning, he only really had him and like 3 other people. So I guess a total of 4. 4 people working on this system, and he was given some ambitious goals set by Yamauchi. They wanted it to sell 1 million hardware units of the new console. It had to be under a certain price point. 1 million units sold, I believe, within the first, I guess, of all time. That's just what he was hoping for. It ended up selling a lot more than that, but it had to be under a certain price point with cheaper technology in order to keep the budget down, which is kind of one of the things I noticed when doing research for this. A lot of the luck of how the Famicom became so successful was very, I don't know if serendipitous is the right word for it, but a lot of things just fell into place that despite the struggles, it ended up working out. So like the Famicom, they went with a 6502 processor, which was not common in Japan at the time compared to everything else, but they had to, because at that time when they were developing the system, computers were that was the primary thing. MSX, big PC computers, like everything was like they were hogging up all the chip manufacturers, and they couldn't. So Nintendo, a small company like you said, Stefan, at the time didn't really have the leverage in order to get in there and get the chips they needed at any reasonable rate for them to produce. So they decided to switch over to the 6502, which was less sought after and cheaper because not as many people used it in Japan.
And I think that sort of started Nintendo's it almost became a like a tent pole of their manufacturing and their design philosophy and everything. Just kind of basically the race to the bottom, right? So like, I mean, it's now common for Nintendo to be the underpowered system so that they can drive down the cost. And so every generation within memory, basically until recently, I think Nintendo's always been the cheaper system. Like the Game Boy was probably the most interesting example where you had all of these handhelds putting in color screens, but then that was like sucking up battery like crazy, and like Nintendo's like, no, we're cool, we're just gonna we don't need color, it's fine, we don't need backlight, it's fine.
Definitely a very different situation with N64, but that would be kind of the exception where it's like, hey, we're having our hardware designed by this company that makes the computers that make Jurassic Park stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, right.
Well, no, the GameCube too. The GameCube was their ethos with that was to go for like the powerhouse of that generation.
Right.
And it didn't work out. And then they went back on and made the Wii, right, which was underpowered and sold what I think it is their best set. Maybe the Switch.
No, the Switch. Now, the Switch surpassed it. Switch is their best selling system
for a long time. Wii was their best selling console ever.
But
technically the DS is their because if you count the DS as a system, it sold like 100 and it was just slightly below the PS2.
Oh, if you count it as like a family of systems.
Yeah.
Portable.
Sorry, Dry. What were you saying?
Well, I mean, talking about the hardware you were mentioning about, I just kind of thought it was funny that you said that, they knew the Game & Watch wouldn't last forever. So they were working on the NES. And it's kind of funny to think like, well, the NES didn't last forever too, but actually it kind of did. I mean, they were making games for it deep into the 90s. And, hey, I mean, the people in this room are still using that hardware today. And not only that, like new games are being developed for it. Like not only just like homebrew games, but like people like get their new NES games like put on cartridges that are like sold.
I have a Jay and Silent Bob game for the NES.
Yeah.
Also, some territories like Brazil were making of like quote unquote official as anything in Brazil got. But like they were still making games like up until very, very recently.
Yeah.
And like they also used like NES, like a lot of those like ridiculous handheld, like the plug and play TV games and like stuff like that. That one of at least one of the Atari flashbacks was an NES on a chip. So like they're still using the NES for stuff like that as well.
Yeah. And the someone that I interviewed once was part of the kind of the core like NES like development community online. And he told me that the NES is actually very unique in terms of the number of signals that go between the cartridge and the system. The only thing that he really considered comparable might be the Neo Geo. And that basically means you can offset so much stuff to the cartridge itself. And the expandability of the NES definitely had a lot to do with its longevity. I know that I think most people probably think more of like the Super Nintendo when they think of like, oh, it had the Super FX chip.
Right.
And I think that's only really famous because they had that really snappy branding for it.
Yeah, they branded where all the different chipsets for NES games were not like, they didn't like brand it.
Exactly. It wasn't like, oh wow, this thing lets you.
It's got an MMC3.
Yeah. You can scroll up and down and left and right and diagonal and
that
all
was
that
was also during like the bit wars where like anything you could put a number on meant something to like these kids who like had no idea what it actually meant. But, like, and just like it was the same thing with like the Neo Geo famously would put the like however many megs the cartridge was. They'd slap that in as marketing. It's like, who the fuck cares? Like, it doesn't actually matter.
Yeah. I mean, the only difference is like, you could have like if your game was deemed by the publisher to be worth the cost of a larger cartridge, then you could get more sprites and animations and levels packed in there. But yeah, it is funny that because the size of a cartridge isn't really comparable to the power of it, right?
Can you imagine if we still like talked about our modern systems in the terms of bits? How many bits is a PS5?
So many bits.
I don't even
So
want to think.
all-
But it's funny
all-
because
all of the bits.
now it's the opposite with marketing, where it's like if someone says a game is like 200 gigs, you're like, Jesus fucking Christ! Like, why? Why is
Yeah,
it
because
so?
you have to download that thing.
I
So now you're
know.
just like,
I was actually rather surprised when I opened up Final Fantasy 16. I'm like, oh, this is only one disc. I thought it would be more.
Oh, wait till that Rebirth, baby.
I know.
2
That like
discs.
so funny. Like they
We
said
have
like
to advertise
on 2
2
discs. It's like, was that
that
really
was
necessary?
just for the PlayStation stands. That's for just for the PS1 Final Fantasy fans. Or it's like my friend literally bought the 360. Well, my one friend Andy literally bought the 360 version of Final Fantasy 13 because it was 2 discs instead of the one on the PS3. He's like, it's just like it was back in the PS1 days. Wild. So some real other quick things on the chip. The chip thing, I know it would normally be boring, but I think the reason I wanted to bring up the 6502 was 2 reasons. One, because they went with this chip, they hired Rico to do it, and Rico was the one that. Sorry, Rico is the one that pushed them to go with the 6502. And they were able to develop that relationship with Rico, who just had a new state-of-the-art manufacturing center built. So the reason why would Rico go with Nintendo, a relatively new company? Uemura used to work with the dude who was like one of the head engineers at Rico. So because of the business relationship he already had with them, it put Nintendo at the top of the list and they got in right away. And because they went with the 6502 chip, that they ended up seeking people who knew how to use it, which were very limited in Japan at the time. Who was one of the few people who knew how to use it? Future president of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata. Who he was kind of a self-taught expert with the chip. He used it to program his Commodore's PET computer, so he knew all this stuff prior. And I mean, we've all heard stories of Iwata, of just some of the stuff he ended up doing between like Smash Bros. And Pokemon Gold and Silver, and working at HAL, creating HAL, and being the president there. And the dude he's a legend. I mean, rest in peace. And
single-handedly saving Earthbound.
Yeah,
I love that story where it's just like, oh, this game's not going to get made. No, I'll just finish it. It's fine.
Didn't he say like you will finish this game in like what is it? He said like 4 years if you go the way that you currently do. If you scrap everything and let me do it, you'll finish it in like 1.
Yeah, he legit was just like, yeah, let's just start over and I'll just do it. Like that's not an A-type personality. I don't know what that is.
The primary but the 6502 chip I just can't say enough about, just because like not necessarily about the geeky tech specs and all that other stuff, but because of that decision with by getting Uemura, who then got them a relationship with Rico, who then pushed them to the 6502, got them Iwata, and because of that, it also made when the Famicom took off, there was less people to compete with them because no one knew how the fuck to program for the thing, because Nintendo scooped up all the programmers for it. So it was this crazy perfect storm of problems that, because they solved them in the right way at the right time, it just ended up, the system just went crazy. It didn't sell great initially, but obviously by and not even in 85 when it released in North America, but as time has shown, it's now one of the most iconic consoles of all time. I don't really I have a lot more notes in here for the Famicom thing, but I don't really want to go into all of them. There's unless there's stuff that you guys see about the specific set, because a lot of this is very hyper specific things. They got the D-pad from the Game & Watch, talking about how the 2 ROM things. So actually, you did kind of bring up that a little bit with how like the system transfers data. How much do you know about the MMC chips? Do you want to go into any of that?
I mean, I don't know a whole ton, but it is interesting, how basic the early games on the system were. A lot of them I don't think use mappers at all, or very basic mappers. And a lot of the early games were, what we know of over here as the quote unquote black box games. And I gotta admit, I don't like too many of those that much. Like, they're definitely iconic. But it's really that expandability that I think gives the NES such legs, because I think a lot, I think a lot of younger people might not really know how good the NES gets, because oftentimes, Nintendo is really pushing on services like Virtual Console, and then later the Nintendo Switch Online, that you always got, your Clue lands and whatever that, no one really cares that much about. And they're probably like, oh, these are, not that much better than Atari.
I did play Clue Land on stream, so I'll give it that credit.
But it's like some of those games are totally fine, but really it was like Super Mario Brothers that, for me, and like I already said, it was my first game ever, so it did set a lot of like expectations for me personally. But like, to me, like, that is the birth of modern gaming, and I don't even know off the top of my head what mapper Mario 1 uses, but
it didn't use any.
Well, I mean, so it's
yeah, sorry. The thing with Mario is that Mario 1, if you don't put any mapper chips on an NES cart, it was the max the system was able to do. Sorry, what, Stefan?
For the benefit of the audience, should someone explain what a mapper is?
That would...
Sure. I mean, a mapper is just like, like we were mentioning before, like Super FX hardware is probably the most famous one, or the chip that like Sega used in Virtual Racing for the Genesis, where it's just expanded hardware to offload processing to the cartridge that lets it go beyond the system's just bare capabilities. So it's called a mapper because it remaps functions, and the flow of signals through the system, to create something beyond its means. So yeah, it's a little bit of a weird term if you think about it, but that's just what they're called. And that's a big thing when it comes to like emulator compatibility and stuff. Like, what mappers does it support? Of course, the official ones are normally all supported, but there's also a lot of like fan-made mappers and pirate game mappers and stuff like that. So it's just expanded hardware in the cartridge that will let it do things like Mario 1 doesn't scroll up and down, but later Mario games can scroll up and down.
Mario 3 was on the MMC3, the MMC3 chip, the mapper. I forget what MMC it's one of it. It's like mapper something, but I forget what the other M stand for. But yeah, there was basically a bunch of different chips. The most common are the MMCs, MMC 1 through I think 5, if I remember off the top of my head. And Mario 3 was on the MMC3 chip. I want to say there was a handful of games on the MMC2, or maybe I think there's only like one. And on the MMC1 chip, what it allowed is that you could scroll both horizontally and vertically, just not at the same time. So games like, I want to say, Kid Icarus and Metroid were on the MMC1 because they could go... Like, that's why in Metroid, if you go, you can only go left to right or up and down. There's not doing it both at the same time. And then obviously later, and I'm not going to go through all the details of each one, A, because I don't have them all memorized, but B, that would be a little boring. But I do think what's interesting, there is what you were saying before about like the pirate chips and some of the non-common ones, like Konami did some that never came out over here in North America, like Castlevania. I think Castlevania 3 had an extra chip in there, right?
Several games. It's the VRC 6, I think, something like that. And then there's also the VRC 7, which was I believe it was actually used in 2 games, but the only game that used it for any audio expansion was Lagrange Point, which is like kind of a cool Phantasy Star-esque RPG. But yeah, I don't really know the tech details of why it is, but for whatever reason, there seems to have been fewer remapping capabilities built into the NES compared to the Famicom, because for whatever reason, you just couldn't have that expansion audio where you have.
I didn't know if it was a tech. I thought it was more just like the companies didn't want to spend the money on the chips to bring it over, because Nintendo of America had some crazy like the way they, obviously Nintendo in Japan originally was a lot looser,
Right.
less strict with how they allowed third-party companies to develop for it, versus when it came over to North America, it was incredibly strict and very anti-competitive.
There is a tech limitation to some extent. I don't really know the details, but I mean, like for example, if you have an EverDrive and you want to load up Japanese ROMs on an NES, to my knowledge, I've not actually had this particular mod done, but like my EverDrive is for Famicom, not for NES. So I don't actually have the means to test this myself, but my understanding is you have to have a separate mod to enable expansion audio support on an NES. It won't just work. So yeah, for some reason it's not just there normally in the system. So things did because if you think about it, of course it was it was cheaper to not manufacture the cartridge, but at the same time, think of all the engineering effort that would have to go into reconfiguring Castlevania 3 to work on a different mapper and configuring the music as well, right? So there's you offset some costs and increase other costs with that situation. But the mappers, that was really, and not just mappers, but also developers getting intimately familiar with the system is what gave it legs, I think, well into the 90s. I mean, I was actually just thinking earlier today about how interesting it is. I mean, you would think that developers would be like, okay, like our A team is on Super Famicom and now our B team is just putting out some piddly games on the Famicom and NES, right? But then you look at something like the Adventure Island series, for example. The first Adventure Island was a pretty early, very basic game, right? And then you have releasing all around the same time in the early 90s, you have Super Adventure Island on Super Nintendo, New Adventure Island on the PC Engine / TurboGrafx, and Adventure Island 2 on the NES. All these are coming out around the same time. And it's actually the Super Nintendo and TurboGrafx ones are much more similar to the original game. They're very good games. I really enjoy them. But then you look at the NES game and it's like, it's got an inventory system. It's got branching paths, many, many, many more levels than the ones on the more powerful systems. It's got multiple dinosaur buddies that you can ride, which is like famously something that Miyamoto considered for Mario 3 and didn't realize until the Super Nintendo. So it's just interesting how much people, developers were able to achieve on the NES, and in some cases do some things that may have been more technically interesting on the NES or Famicom hardware versus 16-bit hardware. Although it's debatable whether the PC Engine and Super Nintendo are technically 16-bit systems, but that's a conversation for another time.
Look, the fact that the NES managed to get no less than two games starring Jackie Chan on it. I mean, come on. Because we all know Kung Fu, that's Jackie Chan. Come on.
It's supposed to be, right?
It is. His name is Thomas because that's Jackie Chan's name in Wheels on Meals with Sammo Hung.
And then Spartan X 2. Is it called just
Spartan X is what it's called in Japan.
Okay. But then there's also there's a sequel on Famicom as well. That's
no less than two. No less than two.
No less than two. No less.
What is it? but you're right on. You're spot on, Try, with the fact that how much the chips enhance the capabilities of the systems and gave it much longer legs. In fact, Dave, I don't know how much you'd be able to talk about it, since it's kind of like I'm just throwing this over to you right now, but you covered a game on your Family Corner series. It was, I believe you said it was like the last ever official quote unquote Famicom release. It was Joy Mech Fight.
I don't know if I said that, but I mean, if it's right, yes, I said that. Yeah, my main focus on Joy Mech Fight was just how, because that was always something with the NES, and you don't really think of the NES as a game system that handled fighting games well, at least the traditional fighters. We think of that as more like Super Nintendo is where that was really becoming a thing. I mean, we got so many fighting games on the Super. We got Turtles Tournament Fighters on there, but we also did get that on the NES. But that's a later release. But Joy Mech Fight was really unique because of the way that the sprites were handled, because it sort of separated those body parts, and that's why every creature in it is this weird robotic thing of blobs, because they could have them sort of, the different sprite pieces could separate out as if they were different sprites as part of one sprite. And it's kind of the best Famicom fighting game, hence the title on the YouTube for that video. But yeah, Joy Mech Fight, it's a good one. Famicom exclusive.
I watched that video, man, and I was blown away, especially by the visuals. I'm very impressed by how they were able to do that. It's wild.
And showed up in Smash. He finally showed up in Smash many moons later. Very obscure. That's Smash for you.
So yeah, I don't know if there's anything more I want to talk about in terms of the lead up to the launches of the system. I think we've talked a lot about the tech and stuff pretty well with it.
We've also talked about the last games for the system. Podcast. We've jumped ahead to the end.
What I want to talk about next is the launches. Obviously, none of us have really a lot of any familiarity with the Famicom launch in '83, since we weren't in Japan at the time. The things that, from my understanding of that launch and that in the era before it came over, to North America, was that it had a lot of similar issues that you saw with what happened to Atari and the North American game crash in '83. Because there was a glut of content, not a lot of quality control, and Famicom also had a product recall due to a faulty motherboard, which was costly. They both released in their respective, it released with very little fanfare. In fact, as I talked about in my SG-1000 video, it came out on the exact same day as Sega's SG-1000. And it even had a smaller launch lineup than the SG-1000, though obviously this went on to be much more popular than the SG-1000 did. But while it was popular, it was decently popular, it still had a lot of issues, and bringing the system over to America was a real challenge. They, because of that market crash here in North America in 1983, even though consumers still wanted to play games, I think that's a weird, understated mixed message or dichotomy. I don't know what word I'm looking for, but it's a understated aspect of it. It's the fact that, yes, we had the market crash because there was a glut of shit games and not a lot of quality control, and then no one wanted to buy it. And so retailers were, gun shy, trigger shy on trying to get something new or get a new video game system in. But consumers still wanted to play games. Arcades were still pretty popular, and obviously there was gaming on the home computer market. So Nintendo saw that there was still a desire, there was this mixed messaging that consumers clearly still like games, but no one really knew how to market it to them. So Nintendo tried their hand a few times to break into it. Beforehand, they tested the waters with the Nintendo Versus system, which was just basically an NES in an arcade cabinet where you could do versus play, player against player in specific games. And it did pretty well. So they knew there was something out there for them. So they decided to do the ultimate of Trojan horses. Does anyone want to talk about Rob? Anyone want to jump in on that?
No one wants to talk about
Trojans. Anyone wants to talk about Trojans?
I
and their love
love
hotels.
I love the aesthetics of Rob, but I've never owned one, and he doesn't look that fun to play with. You know,
Same.
He sure isn't.
funny story. So a friend of mine wanted me and his wife to get to experience what it was like playing Gyromite with Rob. So
What a hot date.
He came up with this idea that he programmed some bizarre. I can't even really remember the details, but he programmed this like weird system of where we had to like call out something like, you know, it might have been like blue cookie or something like that, where like only one person could see what the how can I describe it? Only one person could see the translation of the commands, and they would change like every 20 seconds or something like that. So like up would be a color and B would be a thing or something, right? And so somehow or other he had it so that like one of us was with the controller and the other was calling out the commands. So you have this like delay in processing and understanding in executing the commands to play Gyromite. And it was actually really fun. But because if you're just playing Gyromite without Rob, it's like dead simple because like you see exactly what you have to do, and it's like there's like not really much of any way you're very likely to mess up too seriously, right? But if you're two humans trying to
one's pretending to be Rob
in this ridiculous way, it actually does a decent job of simulating the Rob experience.
Nope, I hated everything about that story.
Oh my god. Well, for those who don't know, I'll do a quick synopsis since Rob does not appear to be a popular man in this crowd here. Honestly, understandably so. Rob was so in an effort to basically trick retailers into not thinking this was a video game system, Nintendo radically changed the design of the Famicom from being a top loader, which was so synonymous with a video game system. Atari had effectively killed the top loader system for a number of years because of the crash in '83. So whether obviously it wasn't intentional, but because of that crash, like it was a death knell. Like no retailer would have bought it. So they decided like, well, let's change it around. Let's call it an entertainment system. It's not a video game system. It's an entertainment system, which is why you get a gun and a robot. It's not just video games. You can be entertained in other ways. And they switched the cartridge from being a top loader to a front, to like a slot, like it's to look similar to a VCR, VHS player. So they did all these different things just to trick retailers into buying the system, and then they also added Rob to, like, it's kind of like a Trojan horse. Even in the interview I was talking about before, Uemura was like, yeah, he wasn't very good, but he did his job. He was there for his reason, and then no one needs to talk about him.
He looked like a toy, right? Because that was the thing, is that they were trying to get retailers to stock it in their toy aisle.
Right.
And so they put in a robot. It didn't. He could have had zero functionality, and he still would have served his purpose.
I mean, I think it's an appealing looking toy, if nothing else. Functionality aside,
nerds across the world have one sitting on their desk.
Yeah.
Well, he was the inspiration for the design of WALL-E.
Oh yeah,
it's not true, but man, it sounded so true.
You got
it. But he does have a WALL-E look to him. True. He's got a WALL-E look to him.
While we're talking about this, you know, this sort of shaky early launch, something that I just thought was so fascinating was this video that released, I think about 3 years ago. It was in 2020. it's if you go to YouTube, it's on Ars Technica, and there was an interview with Gail Tilden, who worked at Nintendo of America in the early 80s, and I believe then correct me if I'm wrong, was she like the first editor-in-chief of Nintendo Power?
She certainly was, and then she left the magazine to go basically launch Pokemon in North America. So she is
wow.
She's Gail is incredible.
She's a bit of a legend, and this interview
and a dear friend. So please don't say anything.
I will not, because she did this awesome interview on Ars Technica in 2020, where I had never really heard like what the 1985 launch was like with like such detail and clarity. And she clearly remembered a whole lot about it, and all the links they went through. And the little nugget that stood out the most to me from that interview was about the box art. And now I don't know. I've never super loved like the black box artwork with the pixels and stuff. Like I love pixels, I love pixel art, but like I don't know. I always thought that the early box art was not as interesting as later boxes where, you know, you had more elaborate artwork and stuff. And especially when you compare it to, say, Atari box art, which, you know, I am certainly no Atari fan. I respect what Atari was and the aesthetic. I love the aesthetic of Atari. And part of the aesthetic I love is that artwork. I mean, Atari box art is high art, basically. It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. But one of the points that Gail made in her interview was it was a very intentional choice for Nintendo to go with that pixel art style for the boxes, because they felt that part of what caused consumer burnout on home video games was, you know, they look at this like really awesome artwork for, you know, a tennis video game that's, you know, got these two players like in this really dynamic pose or something, and then you put in your system and it's like a few dots, it's a couple of dots moving back and forth. Like it's not that it's not
Atari. As beautiful as it was, Atari box art was selling you a lie.
Yes, exactly. And they thought that they could counter consumer burnout by just being very upfront and honest. Like what you see is what you get. Like, you know, the NES tennis box, you know, it's just the in-game graphics, right? It's completely different from you know, tennis or any of these other games. I'm just using tennis as an example. I forget that it might be on my mind because that might have been an example from the video, but it's been a couple of years since I saw it. But anyway, my point is I thought that was really interesting and gave a lot of insight on why early NES box art is the way it is. And you know, it's impossible to really look back and say like, yes, that definitely had an impact on, you know, it getting that foothold in the market. Whether that had a big impact in the long run, who knows? But I thought that was an interesting idea, and I appreciated that. You know, even though ultimately it was like, hey, let's, you know, we think this is going to add up to sales. Like, I appreciate the honesty of it too. You know.
Yeah, and I would also guess that that period of time with, you know, the Atari box art likely has significant influence over the laws we currently have around false advertising. But between like that and like stop motion animation in toy commercials, those are probably like the two biggest culprits of false advertising in the 80s and 90s for sure.
Oh man, that stop motion stuff always got me. It always made me want to. It worked. It fucking worked. God.
What do you mean the Transformers don't transform themselves?
What do you mean they don't? And also, it always pissed me off in those toy commercials where they'd have these amazing, you know, like terrains and setups and like landscapes that they were playing with these toys on, like these super detailed like worlds that they built. I
always thought the same thing. Yeah, sell the dioramas to go with them.
Yes, because I would be like, man, this, you know, this G.I. Joe is really cool, but I don't have any of this other stuff. Like, where's this mountain I can buy?
Just a mountain.
The G.I. Joe Mountain.
1999.
With real rock
but then they made the USS Flag and like no one could afford it. So I don't know.
Yeah, they went
That's
the
true.
extreme.
They're like, you know, we're going to give you this thing. It's like, oh, yeah.
Stick with my Bruce Wayne Batcave.
A couple other things to talk about for the system itself before we go into Nintendo Mania. Just talking about, I would talk about everyone's memories and recollections, and also I think that would be a good spot for you to go off about Nintendo Power, Stefan.
Sure.
Just some quick hits on Nintendo's practices after releasing the NES, after releasing the Famicom / NES in North America. They added a lockout chip, which made it harder for people to basically bootleg games. That was the intention of it, and for a while it worked really well. And there's a whole lot of lawsuits. I think Tengen is involved with a pretty famous one with that lockout chip, which that's a story for a different podcast, because that's enough to fill up its own thing. All the legal shenanigans that went on between Atari and Atari / Tengen and Nintendo and all that stuff. But the thing I'm always fascinated by in this era are the third party licensing practices, because back then, like, Nintendo really for a long time shot themselves in the foot with third party developers because of the ill will they worked up during the NES and Super Nintendo eras. So back then, if you were a third party, there was very strict. I believe you split the profit with them. You also had to order all your cartridges from them. You couldn't order from a cheaper third party source, and on top of that, you were only allowed to publish 5 games a year total.
Which is why Ultra exists.
Konami circumventing it with Ultra. Then other developers did it as well, but Konami is by far the biggest and most well-known example. I always think it's kind of cool. Some people have brought up in the past to how the Ultra label was their more experimental titles, the ones they weren't quite sure. Like, they thought it was good, but maybe it's not going to be the big hit that they all thought it would be. Which is why, like Metal Gear was on the Ultra label. The original TMNT, I want to say, was on the Ultra label.
Which I don't know why it was, but yeah.
Well, in retrospect, you go, oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a great game, but like, I mean, it sold like crazy, obviously.
Sure, but like they were like, everyone was really unsure about that property up until the point that it did gangbusters. Like,
what about Mission Impossible? Was that Ultra Games, or did they Konami label that?
I don't know.
Mission Impossible or Impossible Mission?
Mission Impossible.
Because Impossible Mission was a bootleg.
Yeah, Mission Impossible specifically. I feel like that was an Ultra Games release.
I do not like that game.
Right, again, there you go, experimental, right? It had some different
it is an Ultra Games release.
It had ideas. It didn't have execution.
It may not have been good, but boy, did it have some ideas.
I love shit like that, though. I love it when you go back and you play a game, you're like, wow, this is awful, but I admire the swing they took. Like, I admire some of the weird things they tried.
Well,
yeah, I mean, games don't have to be good to be important, right? So
well, that is a pull quote that I want to use. Stephen Reese. Games don't have to be good to be important. I like that.
It's good.
I mean, really though, I think in a way, like, I mean, this might sound like a backhanded compliment in a way, but like, I kind of feel like that's part of what contributes to the NES being my favorite system, because
bad games?
Well, not bad games. I mean,
charming.
Let's be honest. There are a lot of amazing games. I mean, amazing games. But like, I feel like you can keep digging and digging and digging and digging deeper into the NES library, and like, I'm still discovering things where it's like, oh, this is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess where I'm going with this, I feel like with the NES, I'm able to adopt a more lenient mindset when I'm playing NES games. In that, like, I'm just more easily impressed by like, oh, like, I see what they were going for with this. This is interesting. Or, they don't make games like this anymore. And maybe there's a reason why, but because they don't, I'm playing this and I'm like, you know what though? There's something interesting about this.
I kind of agree with that, Tribe. I never have been able to put it into words, but there's something, and like, I love the Super Nintendo. Love it. But there's something about I have a higher pain tolerance
Yes.
for NES games than even Super Nintendo. Like a Super
100%.
Nintendo game that annoys me, I'm like, I'm out. I'm not putting this away.
Yep.
I don't want to play it anymore.
Yep.
But NES, I'll give it a little bit more.
Yes. Yeah. I can't explain what it is. And, a lot of people might attribute that to nostalgia, but the things I'm talking about are like new to me games, right? Like it's not games that I am nostalgic for. And part of the reason I love NES so much is like I can continue to discover new to me games that I'm like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Like the most recent example for me, believe it or not, would be Amagon, which I don't think is widely considered a particularly good game. Do any of you have experience with Amagon?
I've never even heard of it.
One of the best things about Amagon is that the Famicom version is called Suddenly Macho Man.
Amazing. I'm going to need that Japanese love hotel.
Suddenly it really sells that.
Yeah, suddenly Macho Man. And so you're like,
he wasn't Macho Man.
You're like this little,
and then he was.
You're this little dude. It's a common like a $10 NES game. Pretty common. And you're this little dude, little dorky looking dude with a gun, and you take one hit kills. And then you get this power up that turns you're Amagon, and then you become Suddenly you become Megagon. And you can take many hits and you punch enemies, but and you play this and you're like, this is kind of bad, but also kind of interesting. But then like the more time I spent with it, the more and more interested I got in how the gameplay was structured, because it was this completely bizarre thing where like when you're the little dude with the gun, you die immediately, but you have range, and enemies also drop point increasing items. And normally I'm not really into like high scores or anything. I'm more about just like, that's why I don't really like the pre-Mario, Super Mario Brothers era that much, because I want to have an adventure. I want to go from beginning to end. I don't care about
getting to finish that backlog with a how to beat situation.
Exactly. And so anyway, in Amagon, you can accrue a lot more points as the little dude because enemies drop points. And when you're the big dude, enemies don't drop points. But when you turn into Megagon, your points are translated into Megagon's maximum health. And so you have a much greater chance of surviving through the rest of the level if you hold back and wait and like, am I going suddenly Macho Man too early, or should I wait a bit?
I have gone suddenly Macho Man too early.
I mean, look, haven't we all had those moments?
Especially in those love hotels.
And also, the amount of health that you have at the end of the level then goes back into your points, which then makes it easier to go suddenly Macho Man earlier in the next level. So there's like this really interesting balance of like considerations. Its foundation is on kind of like awkward, janky gameplay ideas, and yet it's like there's nothing else out there like it. So I find it kind of interesting and enjoyable, and I worked my way through the whole game. It was a challenge, but I had a great time.
Now let me tell you about Space Shuttle Project. All right, go ahead.
I want to touch on one last thing before we can really dive into like what you're talking about. Try with different games, and like, because there's so much I want to talk about with the legacy. But before we do that, Stefan, I want to turn it over to you to talk about Nintendo Power. I do want to have you on the show for an official Nintendo Power episode, but at least for the time being, whet the audience's appetite, if you will.
Sure. So Nintendo Power Magazine. This is actually also not only the 40th anniversary of the Famicom, but also the 35th anniversary of Nintendo Power Magazine. So essentially, Nintendo had seen what they were doing in Japan with gaming magazines like Famitsu and magazines of that ilk, and wanted their own U.S. equivalent. And so, rather than trying to do that by themselves, they basically went to a Japanese publisher and partnered with them to create Nintendo Power. And as we mentioned, Gil Tilden headed that up with Howard Phillips. And they would essentially go over to Japan once a month to sit in a room and crank out these issues of Nintendo Power with this completely, at the time, Japanese team. And so it was interesting because it was a magazine that was only made for the US market, but made entirely in Japan, aside from the covers, the front and back covers. And but yeah, I mean, really, the whole idea was that it was a marketing device, and like kids didn't know at the time that it was just a marketing device, but that's what it was, right? The whole idea was that the magazine would get you to finish your games so that you could go buy more games, and and that also spun off the Nintendo Power line, or the Nintendo Gameplay Counselors, as are more commonly referred to, which also, that was the same device. You called in with your questions so that they could help you through the game, so that you could then go buy more games. And that's why, like, famously, they never advertised in the first 9 or 10 years, I think, of the magazine. They never put in an ad at all, because it was an ad unto itself. They didn't need to have external advertisers, because that's what the whole magazine was. So and they never paid for a cover either. Like, you could not pay to get your game on the cover. Those games that were picked for the covers were picked internally at Nintendo, based off of sales. And so basically the whatever game was doing really well that month would get the cover. And so there is a world in which Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt was the best selling NES game for the month, because it got a cover. Of course, things changed as the magazine went along, and then was eventually sold to Future and then Sunset. But yeah, one of the biggest kind of tent poles, I think, of marketing for Nintendo at the time. And it's really interesting to me about the magazine too, is that people's nostalgia for the magazine is like completely compartmentalized from their nostalgia for the console, or the nostalgia for any particular game, because like, and it created these very visceral memories for people, whereas like, typically, I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule, but like, when you think of your favorite game, you think of like a period of time in which you played that game, or a period of time of your life. But like, Nintendo Power, for whatever reason, creates these very singular memories. Like, I remember pulling this issue out of my mailbox. I remember that time that I was at grandma's, sitting on the guest bed, reading about Darkwing Duck, right? It was like these very, very singular memories.
Well, I think that's emblematic of Nintendo in general, like just Nintendo fandom. Something about Nintendo and the fans that connect with the products Nintendo puts out, like that's just a common thread, not just for the magazine, but Nintendo in general. Like, a friend was recently commenting about how, Nintendo emulators are always the ones that get the most love from developers, and emulators for PlayStation consoles or other consoles are often slower moving in terms of development. That's just because people just have this visceral love for Nintendo. Today, GameCube games are, hot. And, people are just, oh gosh, yeah, the GameCube. And, PS2 nostalgia. Personally, I've actually been more into PS2 than GameCube in more recent years, because I, as a bit of a Nintendo fanatic, I kept up with the GameCube better than the PS2. But so PS2 has been more exciting for me personally. But like, GameCube is what, like, a huge thing in retro right now, and has been for several years. But the GameCube obviously didn't sell that well. But the impact that it left on the people who still care today was stronger on the Nintendo side. And I think that, that goes all the way back to the NES era, and it's not just the games, but like you're saying, Nintendo Power as well. Like, you have life memories formed around the games, the systems, and even the magazine.
I think
it's interesting because like for people at home who don't know, one of the reasons why I'm on this podcast is because I run a museum exhibit called the Art of Nintendo Power, where we have over 350 pieces of original artwork from Nintendo Power magazine, and we go around the country and we tour it at shows. And at shows, it's really fascinating because one instance in particular I'll mention, but multiple instances like this happen all the time, where there was this woman who stopped at the cover for Lemmings. It's the NES cover for the Nintendo Power cover for Lemmings, and she absolutely started to break down. And I went over to talk to her, and it turns out that her grandmother had got her subscription for Nintendo Power when she was young, and that was the first issue that she received in the mail, and her grandmother had just recently passed away. And so we through talking, she had no connection, like she'd never played Lemmings, does not care about the game at all, like no actual connection to the game, but the imagery from that cover is so integral to her childhood that it just created this really emotional response.
That reminds me of I was at Missouri, or not Missouri Game Con, Midwest Gaming Classic in Milwaukee earlier this year, and I'm trying to find Andy Cunningham. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
I thought you might be. I was not, but oh my gosh, I spent probably like 30 minutes talking to him because it was the first convention where he had exhibited his collection of
point of sale displays.
Yes. The Nintendo retail experience. And although at that particular show he was exhibiting more like Super Nintendo era, like it was supposed, like he made the room look like a Sears from 1994, 1995.
That's awesome.
It was unbelievable. I mean, I was talking to him for like 30 minutes. And he showed me the book, which I like immediately, like I took his business card immediately when I got home. Like I pre-ordered his book and it came just the other week. And now his book, it details the late 80s era, I think, of Nintendo retail, but it's like a volume 1. But anyway, yeah, I mean, it had like the Game Boy kiosk and the Laserdisc video kiosk and like the boxes and the shelves and all the stuff hanging from the ceiling. It was an incredible experience to see it. And he was talking about how people were in tears, coming in and seeing it. And I was telling him, like, just looking at the pictures in his book was just giving me goosebumps. And that again just goes into that really emotional response that Nintendo stuff just holds over people. I mean, there really is something to it. And he had commented on how he had been a very private collector for a long time, and he had let some people into his house to kind of see his stuff, and he was finally convinced to actually share this and go around to conventions and share this, and this was his first one, and you could just tell that he was just glowing with joy of how this made other people feel. So it was really a really cool experience.
And I think I think this all ties in really well with how I wanted to wrap up the episode. I'm not saying we're wrapping this up, but I mean, like, the final topic, which I'm expecting is going to take a bit of time, is the reason we talked about Nintendo Power as well is because it's all part of Nintendo Mania. After Nintendo, what is it, in 1987, it was like the Christmas gift, the NES. So like Nintendo Mania took North America by storm, and I think to tie it in with what you were saying, Tri, and as well as what you were saying, Stefan, about how like there's these very specific emotional memories both tied with Nintendo and then in turn Nintendo Power, which, like you said, Stefan, it is interesting where it's almost like they're separate, but they're connected but separate. I think the reason is, and I know I'm younger than all of you, but like from a slightly outsider's perspective for that matter, then like when I look back at that era without being able to, I think it just seems to me like Nintendo came in when there was nothing for nothing for kids in North America in terms of a home console. Computers were still pretty damn expensive. You could go to arcades, but once the Atari died in 83 and retailers stopped selling it, 2 years is a long time for a kid. And on top of that, you have a company that's not an American company come in who has different sensibilities, both in terms of business and also just in terms of like artistic design. So you have like this company come in, make an amazing product, and on top of that, it's different than anything anyone else had ever really seen up until that point. So it kind of makes you feel like you're part of something, and then you add Nintendo Power into that, so it's creating it. Nintendo created a culture through Nintendo Mania in the late 80s and early 90s. Like that's not something you really see all that often. Like they create, like there's a culture to a Nintendo fan, I feel like, that you don't get necessarily with fans of other systems and other, like whether you're a Sony fan or a Microsoft fan or I would say Sega did it pretty well too, but that was a lot of it was copying what Nintendo did, trying to actually they went with a different marketing strategy. I'm going all over the place, but what I admire about the NES specifically in this era is just it feels like there is this, it became, because of Nintendo Mania, it wasn't just like here's a big commercial success. It was a cultural phenomenon, kind of like how Pokemon was for my generation in the late 90s. Like it was this thing where you all remember specific elements of that era when you grew up in it.
Yeah, one last thing that I'll say about Nintendo Power, and then honestly, if you guys have any questions you want to field at me, that then I'm happy to answer them too. I didn't really come prepared with an outline for this, but one thing that I think was desperately important about Nintendo Power is that for the children who read it, it created a point of validation, right? Because that, especially like for the early NES generation, like the only feedback that they were getting from anyone outside of their peer group, namely adults, was that this stuff is going to rot your brain. It's affecting your the feedback loop was almost entirely negative from any adult in these children's lives, and so it gave those kids a point of validation to say, oh look, these are adults who know what they're talking about when it comes to video games, that are basically telling me that my passion is okay, right? And I think that was really important. And the same thing, like Nintendo gameplay counselors will tell you this as well. Like they would get children calling that hotline that they didn't have a question. They just wanted to talk to an adult who knew what they were talking about. And they would just like, I just want to talk to someone who knows why Mario is cool. Right. That was so important, and something that like children today would never understand that dynamic, because
video games are cool
at this
now.
point are so part of the so ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist, right?
I mean, even among other kids, like I felt like a little bit of an outcast just because even though other kids probably had game systems, like being passionate about games, that being like the thing you cared the most about in terms of just in terms of worldly interests, at least,
right?
That was weird back then. And I don't have kids myself, and I don't really know a lot about what it's like to be a kid today, but I suspect that's a lot different now. Like you would not be weird about where video games are like the main thing you want to talk about. Like that wouldn't be weird anymore. But even among kids, yeah, it was like, and it was nice just knowing that there was a broader gaming culture out there. It was nice having that magazine, not just to know that, yeah, there's adults writing it, and there's adults making the games. Like, it's not just childish stuff, right? You're right. It was nice. Like, even though those people seem to be few and far between, that there are enough of us out there,
And real quick, I can cut this out if this doesn't work. But Dave, I feel like we haven't given you much of a chance to chime in here. Is there anything you want to add to or like talk about with your experience as with the NES? Back then, like do these type of emotions we're talking about resonate at all with you?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a lot different. Like I never had that feeling. Like it was weird. Because we had a pretty tight knit family, obviously. And we were really close with our neighbors as well, and they also were gamers. And weirdly enough, our next door neighbors, which were basically our best friends growing up, we went to the same school, rode the same bus, and I don't know if their father was like into computers or worked in computers because he kind of had all the latest tech. So their family was always way ahead. So I'm like getting the Vectrex, and they're getting a Super Nintendo. And they had the Vectrex, and every game for the Vectrex boxed, and I'd never seen
all
like
10
the
of them.
box, all 10 of them. I had never seen a boxed Vectrex game until I didn't even know there were overlays until I went over there and saw theirs. And we were just playing on the old black and white. And for me, when it comes to like the sort of adults not getting it, because like I said earlier, my mom has always had an interest in video games. She may not have always been good at them, and she may have had different tastes than me, but she played the NES just as much as we did. Now she sort of tapered off with the Super Nintendo.
Did she realize she wasn't feeding you?
She, yeah, I was so hungry all the time, Mom. But she kind of came back to it with the PlayStation 1. She played some PlayStation games, but I think that move into analog controlling characters is what messed her up for a while.
Was like that for a lot of
3D
people.
cameras messed up a lot of people.
And then she kind of took a hiatus, and then with the Wii, like many adults, older adults, it brought her back into the fray with Wii, and then the DS actually really grabbed her, and she is now, she will play any farm sim, Animal Crossing-esque sort of life sim games. Like that's her world. She was like, oh, there's this new game. It's called The Harvest Moon. I'm like, Mom, let me tell you about Harvest Moon. That stuff goes way back. Really? I don't remember Harvest Moon when y'all were little. I was like, oh, it's been around a while. But she's been playing whatever the newest Harvest Moon is right now. She's like, I found it on my own and downloaded it. She won't even buy physical. I was like, Mom, who are you? I don't even buy digital. But I think I've always been like, gaming has always been a thing. Like most of my relationships were based around some interest in gaming, even though I didn't have the opportunity when I was really young to spend hours and hours and hours in front of the TV playing games. We had one television. We didn't hook up game consoles in our rooms. I did have a friend who had his Super Nintendo hooked up in his room, and I was like, this is amazing. We can play Super Mario Kart all night, because I didn't have a Super Nintendo at the time. I didn't get a Super Nintendo until the Super Nintendo Mini came out.
97.
That was the first system I bought on my own, and which was modded by Voltar. And I always had this passion for games, but it wasn't until that PS1 era that I sort of changed into that, like, this is all I want to play right now. And it really came in that RPG world even more, where, you know, if I went to the PlayStation because of Final Fantasy VII. That's the reason I went to PlayStation, and did not go the N64 route that Try went. You know, his love of the N64 is
Quest 64 not doing it for you.
Nearly insane. My friend had N64, and then I had the PlayStation. I was like, I don't like it. I think the controller did throw me, just the look of it. But from that point on, it was this is something that I want to set an alarm to wake up and play on the weekends. And that was the PlayStation era that really did that for me. NES was like, this is something that is super cool, but it's something that I couldn't put 10 hours into because I just didn't have access to do it when we were younger, like that elementary level gamer David back then.
But even though like you're well known as being like PlayStation's your thing, right?
Oh, PS1 is my favorite console.
But at the same time, like even though that was what sparked your big love of games,
yeah, like the dangerous. That's my World of Warcraft. It's like, ooh, I gotta back it up. I gotta slow down. Too much.
But then, you know, obviously you have a massive NES collection, and the Famicom really drew you in to the point where, you know, you wanted to do a show about it. So you still have found something there about the NES that still drew you to it, and continue to draw you to buying games for it. Even though PlayStation was where your heart was.
Yeah, NES was, I mean, it was the first true video game console for me. And I think there is a little bit of nostalgia, but there's also that it factor that we talked about earlier, where it's like something that draws you back to it. And then when I started to discover, you know, Famicom games that you could easily play without translations, and that just opened up a whole new world of, these are things we didn't even know were happening in Japan. They got a karaoke machine for the what? We didn't get a karaoke machine on the NES. It's just a weird world, and there's just a style to it and a coziness to that NES Famicom world that no other system really does.
Yeah. You know, talking about your, you know, adults in your life, you know, kind of, you know, having an understanding or you know, an okayness with video games and everything.
It was never like, come on, Mom, it's Bowser.
Yeah.
I never got to experience that.
My grandfather called it an Nintendo, and it drove me fucking crazy.
Oh boy.
But
Grandpa.
But Grandpa. But
no
one's gonna get that except for us.
You know, there were definitely times of there was definitely times of like, oh, you know, you're not going to care so much about this, you know, when you're older, or
gotcha.
Things like that. But at the same time, like I do think, you know, over the years, you know, my parents and my mom in particular, like, you know, has found, you know, games to some extent to be like a way to relate to me. Like, you know, it just kind of came to my mind because just this past week, my mom started texting me these photos of these. I don't know if it's knitting or crocheting, but one of those two things. She just cranks out, you know, those yarn projects like mad. You know, she can make a bunch of things in a day, and like she got bit by the bug to like start to like make creatures. So she was like making like cute little octopuses, and then she started making like these things with weird eyeballs, and she's like, hey, here's a monster I made. And then like that got into like, hey, look, I made a mushroom from Mario. Are there any other video game things that I could make?
Tell your mom to make me a VV, please.
And then like, awesome. So I was like thinking of like, what are some simple shapes? And I was like, oh, like what about like a slime from Dragon Quest? And she made a slime from Dragon Quest.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm gonna say it again. I'm gonna need, because we all know your mom loves me. Try, okay? I've never met the woman, but I'm sure she's amazing. I'm sure both your parents are amazing. They made you, so please.
Allegedly.
She hasn't shown me any pictures, but it sounds like she's making a Moogle now. Like she got really she got really bit by this like making creatures thing, and you know, but
she's gonna have an Etsy store in a minute.
Yeah,
but it's funny though, because it's like, you know, she's like sending me all these pictures and like asking for feedback, and I'm like, well, you know, the shape of this is, you know, maybe not quite right, and you know, so it's just, I don't know, it's just kind of become, you know, it's, you know, she's always like, especially, you know, over the years, especially since like, you know, I started doing my life in gaming, and, you know, it's like, you know, become a, you know, large part of my income and everything like that. Right. Like, you know, she very much realizes the legitimacy of this passion I have. And, you know, is not afraid to, you know, kind of delve into it a little bit herself, you know, even if it's just through like knitting and crocheting, right?
Wow. That's so we don't want to get awkward, but how much you pulling down after taxes?
How much money do you make? No,
my dad was definitely one of the people who like verbatim said that no one would ever pay me to play video games, and then I spent the last 20 years in the game industry. So suck on that, Dad.
I do want to start wrapping up this episode, though. Sorry, that's a pretty hard right turn. Not every transition is going to be good, but what I want to end this episode with, and we've danced around this a lot, but I want to specifically kind of give some final thoughts on the legacy of the NES. Like how does it still stand up today? What has it meant to the game industry at large? I kind of want to hear like from one at a time. So I don't really know who to start with. Stefan, we'll start off with you.
Oh, me.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, I think from a legacy perspective, I think one of the most probably influential aspects is the corral of characters that were generated in that time period, right? You don't see very many like Atari IPs.
You don't like Adventure Man?
That
whatever his name
have
is?
their own films, or like today, right? And so like obviously, especially Nintendo, first party properties, like Nintendo wouldn't have to make systems ever again. They could just profit off of their IPs for the rest of their lives if they chose to do so. So I think as far as like influence, whether and it's up to you whether or not you gauge that as a good thing or a bad thing, is that the IPs that were created during the Nintendo generation, or the NES generation, most of them are still around today, and that's certainly something to be said.
Dave, what about you?
Yeah, I could totally piggyback on that, because it really was like the beginning of a lot of gaming icons and the starts of franchises that I still love today. My first Kirby game was Kirby's Adventure on NES, and I loved that game and still love Kirby games to this day. Final Fantasy, like I shared earlier. I mean, obviously Mario, Zelda, all those classics that still go. That's where my love of RPGs started. Might not be my favorite RPGs, though. I played many sad hours of Exodus Ultima on NES because I thought I loved it. Oh boy. And it's funny that Try talked about that array of just things to discover, and thinking back to the wide array of games I even played back then. I may not have had a large collection. There was some rotating of games, and went through that phase of selling all my NES games because we thought our Nintendo was broken and it was probably just the 72-pin connector, but we didn't know. And that's like one of my biggest gaming regrets, is selling that childhood collection, except for my Final Fantasy cart and my Ghostbusters cartridge. I don't know why I kept those two, just because I like Ghostbusters. But going from these RPGs that started on NES and then just seeing the way they've evolved, and then the way they've come back in the form of remakes. Of course, we're in the world of remasters and remakes right now. Super Mario RPG's coming back. What's happening?
Oh, I'm so excited.
Well, I can't wait.
I can't believe that. I just can't believe that. But that's Super Nintendo. Never mind.
Amazing. I'm just excited for QLEX, take on QLEX.
I want to believe that this is a testing ground for a Chrono Trigger.
Ooh, baby. Oh,
that's what I want to believe.
Dirty to me.
So please everyone, go buy 12 copies of Super Mario RPG so that we can get Chrono Trigger.
Yes, but just the ways you could have fun on NES, because you could have those RPG experiences. You could have an adventure like Kirby's Adventure. You could have a way to play out your favorite adventures that you've seen on screen, like Batman Returns, the beat 'em up, just the licenses that happened on NES, and
good licenses.
Yeah, exactly.
Before all licenses were bad.
right. And then that's that weird thing of like, ooh, the LJN licensed games, but there's so many good licensed games. I mean, I even enjoy the Kemco developed Ghostbusters 2, not the new Ghostbusters 2 from HAL. I enjoyed the Ghostbusters 2 game that we got here, published by Activision. And you got weird obscure games from Atlas. You got Rockin' Cats, great game on NES. Space Shuttle Project, like I mentioned earlier, like that's just talk about a unique experimental game that is exclusive to the Nintendo. Like that is a game that you can only play there. Deja Vu, Cobra Triangle, Bigfoot, 3D World Runner. These are all games that I don't know if they would have happened on another system, but I love the NES. The legacy's not going away, and there's so much to experience there, and also with the Famicom counterpart.
Try. We'll round it off with you, and I guess my own shenanigans after that. But try. What about try throwing it back over to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the NES. I would say is really, it's hard to say what how much popularity it has today because we're all of a relatively older age that we can still look at
How dare you.
and say that it's so so important and so iconic. And I often am taken aback when I start to realize, like, wait, like, most of the people writing on game websites today are significantly younger than me. A lot of people write about video games today. The PS3 might have been their childhood. Like,
Yeah.
that is so bizarre to me to think about. And I feel like, more and more people who are writing about games today don't have the perspective on NES or even Super Nintendo, PS1, stuff like that, that we have. Sometimes that, our perspective on that is maybe not always represented anymore. Whereas, it used to be the people who were writing about that stuff were the people with that familiarity. So yeah, I hope the NES still remains an iconic thing for people going forward. But, speaking for myself, I think one of, beyond just the joy it gave me at the time, one of the biggest things that it gave me was just the realization that that good games stay good. It doesn't matter that they're old. And also the desire and excitement for just delving deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into a console's library. Because again, talking about my mom, kind of being supportive of my hobby, back when I wanted to get an N64, once I got the Super Nintendo, I actually stopped playing the NES. I just stopped playing it. I hadn't played it for a couple of years, and then the N64 was coming up, and I'm like, oh, I need this. And my dad is all like, it's time for you to learn about money, son. And so I have to save up, at least in part, for the N64. So it's like, you should sell that old Nintendo you don't play anymore. So he's like, we have a yard sale coming up. Sell your Nintendo. And I sold the Nintendo and, the games I had for $20. And my mom told me, she said, you should not sell that thing at the yard sale. You are going to regret that. And I'm like, nah, I haven't touched that thing in 2 years. And Mom was right. And about
Mom was right.
3 years later, I'm getting more and more into Nintendo Power, and I, start to get access to the internet, and I see like all these people are gushing about all these NES games that I personally had not played because my cousin didn't have them, my friends didn't have them, like the Mega Man games. I missed all of the Mega Man games back in the day.
Wow.
The Ninja Gaiden games and Bionic Commando and Crystalis and stuff like that really stood out to me. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember playing Contra, but I never had it. I remember borrowing DuckTales from a friend. I never had it. Like, wow, there's so much interesting stuff on this system that Blaster Master, that like, it looks great. People are talking about how great it was. And I missed all this. Like I want to experience this. And so like, this was like 98, 99. And here I'm asking my parents to get me an NES and NES games from Funko Land for my birthday in the late 90s. And then, just because of, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Funko Land, but it was a magical place.
Yes.
Where, you could walk in and just about any, NES or Super Nintendo game that you wanted, it's just, you ask for it and it's there, and it's just a few dollars. And that really instilled in me, I would say perhaps earlier than probably most people realized it, because people are like, oh, just sell your old games. I'm not going to play this anymore. The new stuff is better. And, so even from like the late 90s, like I kind of had that coming back to the NES moment that really opened up my eyes to like, I want to hold on to this stuff. I want to and I want to continue to explore and enjoy the libraries of these systems well after they're gone, or, you know, quote unquote gone. They're, you know, discontinued. You know, this stuff is interesting, and I can also appreciate like what, even though it doesn't look as advanced as what might be on the newest system, it is impressive and interesting within the context of the system that it is running on. So especially because as game prices have gone up, I'm glad to have had that realization.
True, thank God.
At a younger age. So yeah, that's, you know, there was the influence that it had on me back then, but there was also, you know, back in its day, but then there was the influence that it had on me still relatively early on, and kind of having that coming back to it moment that instilled the love of retro games that I have today, which isn't just about nostalgia, not just about the games I used to play, but the joy of continuing to explore these games and discover things that I never played before. Like suddenly Macho Man.
The best title.
Suddenly Macho Man.
Yeah, you need to write that song, Stefan. You need to write that.
Yeah, I just did.
For myself, the in terms of legacy and everything, there was an episode of Retronauts a while ago called Misplaced Nostalgia. And the idea of being, you know, you're nostalgic for something you did not get to experience yourself personally. The NES, the Famicom, all that stuff, that is misplaced nostalgia personified for myself. When I look at the NES, a handful of things come across my mind. One, there is an argument to be made, and this argument doesn't happen often in a lot of different instances of games, media, movies, whatever you want to call it, but where the first thing, usually the first thing that creates something is arguably, even if it's not the best, it's always going to be considered the most important for whatever that is. Obviously, like the Atari 2600 wasn't the first console, but it was like the first major mega successful console, right? The NES was not even the first major mega successful home console that, you know, like we said before, like I just said, it was the Atari 2600. So when I look at the NES, I can't say with like any hint of irony that it's not on par in terms of importance with the Atari 2600, at least for North Americans. And I say that because it single-handedly revitalized the industry, the home console industry, and especially in the eyes of retailers, by itself. I mean, yes, there was other consoles that came out even in North America at that time, Master System and whatnot, but like Nintendo had such a huge grip on the market, and you know they have their warts, their bad business practices, but it in terms of just straight up importance, I don't know if I can say it's less important than the Atari 2600 because it really did that much and more for us here in North America and worldwide to an extent as well.
It established the modern video game home console industry that has sustained to this day. There was no
for better
gaps.
or worse.
There was no gaps following that, right?
Yeah, and they
yeah.
And like to what you all were saying before, how I think you said it before, Stefan, where it created this cavalcade of characters and IPs that are all still running today, that we all still know. And I think it ties in with what you were saying, Tri, about how there's just some kind of charm about NES games. And I think a lot of that revolves around the fact, the reason why the NES era I still feel like is so, there's almost like a sheen of mystique to it, is just because things were still being figured out. There, like gameplay ideas and design had not been iterated on over and over and over again, and you know, gone through a ringer to see what sells. Because as soon as you start seeing things that are popular, then there's going to be clones and there's going to be things. So you weed out the ideas that don't sell well or don't hit home with an audience. And for better or worse, sometimes you know there are shit games that don't deserve sequels, and that's why that gameplay style and that game does not exist now. But then it also ends up with, you know, just like something wasn't marketed well, so you go back and you play it and you're like, wow, this is like an example I always like to go to is just like a bizarre, especially because of the title, Kabuki Quantum Fighter for the NES. really solid platformer that not a lot of people talk about, and it's really I really enjoy it. Now granted, a 2D platformer is still a thing, but I think the thing that's crazy about the NES era, and the reason why I have misplaced nostalgia for it, is because when I look at an NES cart, even just looking at a cart, I get the same emotion of like how people describe the original Legend of Zelda, in the sense that what you see on the screen is not actually all that there. Like, you can imagine a world around the borders of the TV screen, and I feel like even the shittiest NES game, it to some extent still elicits that emotion in people, not because the game it's good or bad or any of that other stuff, but because it represents a time where there was still so much up in the air. It was so crazy with like games not knowing what type of styles they were going to be. I mean, hell, look at like the Adventures of Bayou Billy, where they squeeze 4 different types of gameplay into one single game. And they tried all these different things, and some of it works and some of it doesn't. It was an experimental time that set up the game industry for what it is today. And even if you don't have the nostalgia for it, you can go and look at it and the games still hold up. Some of the games still hold up, Mario, Mega Man, despite their difficulty in some instances, and Castlevania, and like they still hold up to an extent. And you can't say that for anything. Like, in what other era of gaming where like I also have no nostalgia for Atari? If I try to play an Atari game, it's not the most fun, but you go back and you play an NES game and there's still something there. So I think to wrap up my thoughts and my feelings on the system is that it is misplaced nostalgia for me. It's something that I can't help but feel wistful when I look at it, when I look at the system and just imagine all the different worlds that this little gray box took people to and got to explore outside the corners of their TV screen. It's just I love the system. I really do. So yeah,
Castlevania holds up to an extent.
Well, no,
We're gonna have words here.
Look, I think look, games are two things. Games are art and games are product. And I think, you know, and it throughout generations, that has been like, which is more, has sort of like been in contest. But I think with the NES, it's probably, there's been no generation where games were so much art and so little product, right? Like where it was gaming really was an art form. Or you know, versus you know, the subsequent generations where, you know, like obviously like the DS was very famous for it being like the shovelware pinnacle, that kind of thing. But I think the NES really holds up as being mostly art and very little product.
Well, that's where, you know, game designers are like first and foremost thinking about like what concept of interaction do I want to create?
Right.
You know,
versus what will sell,
or versus, you know, what is, you know, an interesting character that's going to tell an emotional story and stuff like that, which not to say that stuff is bad, but I think I often think about how younger people possibly define games more by you know, these are my favorite characters. This is my favorite setting. This is my favorite story. And there's not that there's anything wrong with that, because that stuff obviously resonates, and it resonates with me too. Like, you know, there are a lot of games that are just okay that I actually really like the story though, right? That's okay for that to be what draws you in. But I do kind of miss that experimental era of gaming where it's like, you know, what can this character do that's different?
Yeah, and we'll figure out how to sell it later.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, the gameplay concept comes first. It's, you know, the character itself is just a vector for conveying a gameplay concept or a way of movement that the designers thought was interesting.
That's why the commercials are so insane. It's like, wait, what? What do you? What is this game?
Oh man,
that's why
those early Zelda commercials. My goodness,
like, we got to figure something out. How are we going to sell
Oh my God.
Tech tights.
All right. I think that is a good place for us to wrap up this episode with Zelda commercials. What better way? So I want to thank all of you for joining me for this episode. This has been a fantastic conversation on the Famicom / NES. So before we say our goodbyes, or before I say the goodbye to close out the episode, I want to hear from all of you. Where can the good people find you online, and what would you like to promote? Dave, we're going to start off with you. Where can the good people find you online, and what would you like to promote?
Well, you can go to gamedave.com, and that'll take you right to the YouTube channel, or you can find me on Twitch every Thursday night, 9 p.m. Eastern. Game Dave on Twitch as well.
All right, Stefan?
So HR tells me that I'm legally obligated to tell you that I'm a senior producer at Bungie, but which is true. But more importantly than that, I am the executive director of the Interactive Art Collection. We are a 501c3 nonprofit video game art museum. Our current exhibit is the Art of Nintendo Power. Again, we have over 350 pieces of original artwork from Nintendo Power magazine. And we are touring that all over the place at shows. And let's see, the remaining shows this year, we will be at Game On Expo in Arizona. We will be at SAC Gaming Expo. We will be at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. And for the first time, we will be at PAX West, which is very exciting for us. But you can find me if you want to actually talk to me. The best way to do that is on Twitter at Art of NP, or if you just Google Art of Nintendo Power. It's very good SEO for me, so you can just find me.
And finally, Try.
Yeah, I am one half of the team of the YouTube channel My Life in Gaming. We are just just youtube.com/My Life in Gaming, and we it's really whatever we want to do, but we kind of tend to be more known for like retro tech stuff and kind of an accessible way. I always like to say that we dumb it down to my level. We talk to people who understand this stuff, and I confirm that it's accurate and that I am understanding it correctly enough to present it in a video. So I think that kind of sort of the common man understanding of this tech stuff has kind of resonated with a lot of people. But we do other stuff. Sometimes we even talk about modern games, but it's with a long time retro gamers perspective, I suppose. And we also stream on the My Life in Gaming YouTube channel every Sunday night at 8 p.m. And I also stream with the Backloggery crew over on Twitch, the Backloggery Twitch channel, on Monday nights at 7 Eastern.
All right. And of course, as usual for me, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. If you want to email me, you can email me stillloadingcontact@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you can do that in a number of ways. Give it a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use, because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I like feeling warm and fuzzy. You can also support the show monetarily for over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For $1 a month, you get all the episodes a few days earlier at a higher bit rate, plus patron voting rights, which actually at the time this episode releases, a poll will have just ended. I picked 4 different Wii titles that I have never played before. What did I choose? Cursed Mountain, Mad World, Epic Mickey, and I am blanking on the 4th one that I have it up there, but I'm voting on the 4 of them to figure out which game I should play next for a patron voted poll. So yeah, that is patreon.com/stillloadingpod. Also, there's a $4 level. You get everything at the $1 level, plus access to 2 mini episodes every month. And for $5 a month, you get everything that I mentioned prior, as well as access to Still Bonding, which is my James Bond movie podcast where me and a couple of friends bond over 007. Try has been on an episode. He was on the Live and Let Die episode. And the episodes are really fucking long. They're like 2.5 to 3 hours. Though I think I haven't recorded the Moonraker one yet, but The Spy Who Loved Me ended up being 3 hours and 40 minutes. So yeah, it went really, really long. So if you want a boatload of content for only $5, you can listen to me and some friends bond over 007 for many, 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 many hours. But of course, the most important shout out is the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of kids receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. And of course, to shout it back out to Stefan's, also consider donating to Stefan's charity, which, can you say the name of it again quick?
Sure, it's the Interactive Art Collection, and you can actually donate by going to the interactiveartcollection.org.
I will include a link for donation as well right here in the show notes to make that a little bit easier, which I should probably...
I spent $40,000 on framing last year, so just in of my own money, so please rescue me.
And no, now that I say that, I've never done that for the Bit by Bit Foundation, which I literally shout out every single episode. I need to change that. I'm going to include a link right there in the show notes. But that will do it for this episode of Still Loading. Thank you all for listening. Happy 40th to the Famicom and happy 40th to the Famicom and the Nintendo. That's all we got for you this week. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you all next time.